Welcome back to Seeker Strength. Welcome back to Seeker Stan. Today I'm going to talk about what I've learned in trying to accomplish the sub 5 minute mile and 500 pound squat in the same day. At this point, I think I've attempted it more than anybody else has attempted it. It's something that is incredibly difficult to do. So here in April of 2025, the best I've gotten to is a 5:13 mile. I've done the squat loads of times. The squat for me isn't the hard part to do. I've done 3 full training cycles. Each one I kind of manipulated the programming significantly from the one before it, and getting to the point now where I'm very, very refined in what I'm trying to do, but there's been some major learning points along the way. So the first thing is about the running. Now, running a 5 minute mile, if you're a track and field athlete, isn't incredibly difficult to do. Particularly if you're somebody of slightly lighter body weight and you're not pushing the strength numbers quite so hard, it's definitely achievable for most people with correct training, with correct programming and running technique. A 5 minute mile is, for us Europeans, just over a 3 minute kilometre for 1.6 kilometres, right? So many people can achieve this. If you're doing it in 400 metre pacing, it's a 75-second 400. If you're doing a fair bit of run training at a reasonable body weight, it's pretty doable. The problem with this challenge is the squat is significantly heavy enough to necessitate a slightly heavier body weight, right? So it's just less than 230 kilos for a squat single. Being around 100 kilos body weight, certainly being into the mid to high 90 kilos, makes that far more achievable for most people. Even if you're not very talented for squatting, even if you don't have phenomenal strength genetics, you can get to 230 kilos if you get heavy enough with your body weight. This is the first juxtaposition. Being that heavy and running those mile times is quite difficult. And it's not just in terms of the event itself or being able to get your pace up. It's a whole kind of system that's working against you. So the first thing is you're going to have to run a lot of repeats, right? So if you're getting your 400 meter time down, if you're working towards that 75-second 400, you need a fair bit of volume on the running track to get there. And that's where you start feeling it first. The inflammation in your joints, particularly your ankles, knees, hips and back, are going to start giving you some give. The overall volume you have to do every week just to get there in terms of your work capacity then obviously starts adding in on top of that. So definitely, I think for most people, if you're around 6 foot tall, you should be kind of mid to high 90s for this, or I think that's where my ideal body weight would be for this. And doing the appropriate amount of running volume to get you there at the appropriate paces is quite difficult when you're that body weight. The next thing that comes on from that then is having the work capacity to bring that pace through. So if you're quite strong, have some explosive talent, you're able to do that maybe in training 60-second 400s, 65-second 400s quite easily. It's then converting that into just over 4 of those in a row without any break in between. So if you were to do a 400 meter, take a 2-minute break, 400 meter, take a 2-minute break, 400 meter, 2-minute break, it's going to be quite easy to get phenomenal mile times. But obviously, we're not doing that in this case. We want to get the mile done in under 5 minutes. And so you're really looking at kind of 72 to 73 seconds for the first 2 or 3 laps, and then using up the rest of that time for your final 2 laps. In the case of heavier athletes, it's definitely a noteworthy point where it's the 3rd and 4th lap, it's later on in those mile times is really going to hurt you. Most people, if you're training for this with fairly good structure, you're going to be able to get those times done on a running track. It's linking multiple ones of those together is quite difficult, and that's where you start to stray into slightly longer runs to try and bring your overall work capacity up. Now, this is definitely a mistake I made. I was definitely running a lot of kind of 5Ks, 3-kilometer repeats, 2-kilometer repeats. So getting up quite an amount of running volume at appropriate paces, but it just takes a massive toll on your body. So you really have to be playing with that balance and scales all the time with your run programming to make sure, firstly, you can hit that pace and know you're going to be able to run at that speed, but then secondly, bring the work capacity element into that and be able to run at that speed for the necessary distances. I think for most people, that's going to be the major crux of this, or where the difficulty will lie. The second challenge here, obviously, then is the squat, right? So most people, as they're squatting, they'll be getting a small bit heavier, gaining a small bit of muscle mass, probably doing it in a calorie surplus. You're probably doing some supportive accessory exercises with the squats. And this is the first place we'll come up against a challenge with our squat programming. The squat programming for something like this, whether it's 5 and 500 or whatever it is you're trying to do with your own hybrid goals, you have to be as efficient as possible. And my first kind of rule of thumb here is, if you're challenging yourself to anything like this, you need to be challenging yourself to get back to those numbers. I definitely don't think in most of these cases, for these very, very lofty hybrid goals, you really can't be aiming to do it for the first time when you're doing that kind of hybrid training system. In most cases, you're far better off having done big running blocks and trying to get back into running shape, and then especially in the squat, having done years of squat training to get back in that squatting shape is a hell of a lot easier than trying to achieve both of those things at the same time for the first time. Now, this idea of getting back in shape is something that is massively covered in the literature. It's something that every coach and every experienced athlete will know. The amount of work it takes to get back in that shape or back to those numbers for the second, third, fourth time is so much easier. It's not necessarily that it continues to get easier every time, but it definitely is easier the more you do it. In my case, I've squatted 230 kilos probably 6 times at this point. I've certainly been in shape to do it many, many more times than that. And even in the last 2 times I've attempted the 5 and 500, I would estimate my squat shape to be in kind of 240 to 245 kilo 1RM estimates, rather than reaching that 230 or 500 pounds for the first time ever. The other thing that comes along with our squat challenge is something I mentioned earlier, and that is not having a lot of extra capital to use in the gym. If we're pushing our squat quite hard, if you're running one of our squat programs, whether it's RTA 1, RTA 2, any of the weightlifting, any of the powerlifting programs, you'll see a lot of supporting accessory exercises. Now, when you're doing these kind of hybrid blocks, you really don't have time or the training or recovery capital to be doing a massive amount of accessory work. There is certainly a minimum threshold there to be able to keep your form, to be able to stay efficient and stay in good movement patterns with the squat, but it is certainly not something you can be driving those accessories quite hard with. If you're in the hybrid period, you're really as slick and as streamlined as possible. It's that old Rogue Fitness thing of high speed, low drag. You want the programming here to be as high speed and low drag as possible. The final aspect then of the squat programming is that it doesn't take that long to get back in squat shape, and so you probably don't need to be doing very structured planned squatting for 6 months in advance of this challenge. I know for me it's definitely a mistake I made in the past. I got back in squat shape very, very quickly, and around 4 months out from that goal, I was far too strong for where my running was. So in that case, I just took a month out of back squatting. I went just front squatting for a while. Front squatted 200 kilos for a nice little PB on the way. But it is definitely something you need to be aware of, that when you're peaking your squat, you're not going to stay at that 230 kilo squat for the entirety of the challenge. So you certainly need to be thinking about your timings, maybe looking back through old training journals and see how long it took you to get into that ultimate squat peak form last time, and now try and emulate that as closely as possible. I think for most people, somewhere around 3 months is an ideal place to be planning out from a squat 1 rep max attempt. The next thing then is a question I got quite regularly, and that is how I'd plan the day itself. The day itself is not that difficult. In terms of these challenge, whether it's the 5 and 500, whether it's a 200 kilo squat and a sub 20 minute 5k, whatever it is, the day itself is not that difficult. Now, this, of course, is if you're not doing something like Fergus Crawley did, where he went and ran a marathon afterwards, or even Adam Klink, where he's doing unbroken pull-ups afterwards. All of these things add more difficulty into the planning of the day itself. But in terms of the challenges, you'll have had multiple instances over the course of the months leading into this where you're going to be squatting quite heavy and running quite difficult runs in the same day to kind of practice it. So the day itself isn't the real difficult part of it here. The part of it that's difficult is just being in shape for both things within the same rough kind of week, right? I think if you were to restrict this down to 72 hours versus 24 hours, it's just as difficult, or it's almost as difficult as it would be to have it in the same 24-hour time period. The problems here, as I mentioned previously, the body weight, the total training volume, the total amount of different things you have to do in training. I know it seems quite simple on the outside of you just need to run pretty fast and squat pretty heavy weights, but the challenge really is holding both of those things when the body weight mightn't be quite there for the squats, and then for the running you're already quite fatigued from the running at that body weight while doing squat training, and that's where the real challenge lies. For me personally, I think within a few days of each other is almost just as difficult as within the same day itself. I know last time I tried it, I did one of the heavier days before I got injured, did a 200 kilo squat and a quite fast mile time in the same day. So it's definitely not something where I feel like most of you will break down if you try to do this. I think most of the breakdown happens when the squat volume is in the kind of intermediate to high volume phase, and the running is in that point where you're really hitting a lot of intervals and there's a lot of impact coming through the body. The final thing then is something I get asked all the time, and do I think it's doable for most people? Well, look, I failed it 3 times. I'm not going to sit here and say it's doable for me. I certainly think I'm giving it a good whack, and it's something I'd certainly love to achieve at some point in the future. But in terms of the general population, I probably don't think this is an achievable goal for most people who train. Now, why do I think that? Well, the first thing is the amount of people who have run those times and squatted those weights in the same lifetime is quite low, right? And if you want to do this goal, as I've mentioned, I think you have to have achieved both of those or come close to both of those at some point in your past. The second thing here is I think the amount of training you have to do just necessitates you giving a lot of time and a lot of recovery capital to it. And most adults just don't have that amount of time or recovery capital to give to it. I will say that people who do have that might be professional athletes, and they certainly don't have the physical capital to give to it, because you're certainly not going to be able to do this in your off season from being a professional football, soccer, volleyball player or whatever it is. It's just going to be difficult to actually fit it in logistically. What do I think would be a better goal? I certainly think bringing the squat down slightly would be better for many people, or more achievable for many people. I think around the 200 kilo goal is a phenomenal level of achievement for many people to get to. Even just myself and Owen chatting have talked about it multiple times, how few people ever get to squat 200 kilos. And so certainly I think putting the squat to 200 is a really good goal to try and achieve. If you wanted a run goal to go along with that, I certainly think a sub 20 minute 5k would be a good goal to put with that. It's going to be a difficult challenge, definitely. I certainly think the sub 20 minute 5k is going to take more out of you on the day itself. So I think in terms of fitting those into the same 24 hours, it's going to make it quite difficult. And I think it's a great goal for a lot of people to try and chase and try and achieve. The last thing I'd like to say on this, guys, is that hybrid training is phenomenally enjoyable. You're going to be in the best shape you've ever been in your entire life. You might lose some upper body mass if you're used to a lot of bench pressing and doing a lot of bodybuilding, but the shape you get into, how strong you feel, how aerobically fit and explosive you feel, it is just a unbelievable level of fitness to get to, and I'd highly recommend trying to chase a hybrid goal like this if you're looking for something to do with your training. If you're looking for some information around hybrid training, myself and Owen just sat down and wrote 30 chapters, every single piece of information you need to know for your next hybrid goal. You're going to get those in email, 1 chapter per day for 30 days. It's completely free. Follow the link below and hopefully you get some useful training out of it.